are you running a tape over there so
I
that
am.
I need to stay in the same place?
Yes. My name is Wesley Chenault. I'm interviewing Alan Jones. Today is November 30th, 2004. This is for the Atlanta's Unspoken Past Oral History Project, and we are in the Archives Conference Room of McElreath Hall. Mr. Jones, if you will, please begin with some biographical information about yourself.
I was born in Conyers, Georgia, Rockdale County. And as far as we could ascertain, somewhere around 3:30 in the afternoon at home. And prior to entering grammar school, my sisters were taking the train to drive to Atlanta to work. To ride to Atlanta to work. So that got too long a trip. So we moved to Atlanta and wound up on Elmira Street, which was right around the corner with the houses that you see in the cyclorama that are shown on DeKalb Avenue. And I entered Moreland Grammar School at the elementary school, then went to Bass High School, and then Georgia Tech, graduating from Georgia Tech in 1960. I have had, I was one of 4 boys and 2 girls, although there was a 5th boy who died at birth, or shortly thereafter birth. And there is still one sister living who's 83. One brother recently died that was 81. And my father had died when I was about 1 year old. He was in the service and contracted pneumonia. My mother died when she was about 76. And one of my other brothers died maybe 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago. So that leaves today 1 brother and 1 sister. 2 brothers and 1 sister. One of the brothers has 2 sons, and one's got family of their own, and one is gay and has a long-term relationship. The other brother did all the work. He had 7 girls and 2 boys who have multiplied enormously so that there's about 55 of them now, and there seems to be a wedding or a birth every month. So at the last family reunion I had, there was about 80 people.
Oh.
Quite a picture when we put all that group together for their group picture. Since you want me to go from that biographical history into after Georgia Tech?
Sure.
Okay. Then after Georgia Tech, the first thing I did was during the time at Georgia Tech. Well, let me back up. I'll give you the other part too. In those days, it was characteristic to go to work early. So I went to work at around 10 years old. That was too young to be a paper boy. However, I'd gone, because that's what all boys did, was go and work. And I had been shagging balls on the golf course where you pick up the balls as they practice driving. So it was time at 10. So I went down to the newspaper office and applied, and they said I was too young. So I went back home, and my mother said, well, I'll walk back down with you, and we'll see. So we walked back until I got across the street from the newspaper office, and I said to her, if you'll stay here, I'll get the job. And I don't know how, I do not remember, but I got the job. Started delivering papers on McLendon and 3 streets that went off of, actually 3 streets that were off of McLendon. And then probably by the time I was 14 to 16, somewhere in there, I became branch captain. And then they asked me to come downtown to work while I was in high school, working on the complaint desk, which changed my life a lot because the other 3 to 4 guys that were working on it were from North Fulton. I was from Little Five Points. I had not had exposure to the highly affluent culture that the other guys were working in. So that's when I got first introduced probably to Garden Hills Theater and seeing interesting films there, and also to a different style of life, which certainly affected me in ways. From there, let's see, that was the Constitution. Okay, I left them to when I was at Georgia Tech. So I worked there both when I was high school and then the first part of Georgia Tech. And I left the Journal-Constitution because at Georgia Tech, I was in it as industrial management. And I saw a note on the bulletin board about, I don't remember what the words were exactly, but it looked like you were training and make good money while you're at Georgia Tech. I applied, and it turned out to be as a campus agent selling life insurance for Provident Mutual of Philadelphia, which was a great old Quaker company. So I became a campus agent and excelled in that and continued in the insurance business after I graduated from Tech. Although the day I graduated from Tech, I had been drafted. So actually the day I graduated from Tech, I went to Dobbins Air Force Base and joined the Air Force Reserve. And they said, "What school do you want?" And I said, "Well, what's the shortest?" And they said, "Air Police." So I said, "Well, I'm an air policeman." And so shipped out to Lackland Air Force Base and did the basic training. And then from there into Air Police School, and learned something very important there about anarchy, because there was, between basic training and the Air Police School start, there was a week, and you stayed in a barracks called Party Awaiting Transfer, and there was no supervision, and it became like Lord of the Flies or something like that. You had to protect yourself every minute, keep everything locked up. And so that was my first lesson in what anarchy was all about. Got out of that into Air Police School with Sergeant Green. The first day, there were 4 of us that were college graduates. The rest of the 70 were high school graduates. First day, Sergeant Green calls us college graduates in, and particularly looks at me and says, "You are a complete fuck-up." Now, I had been nothing but the perfect boy during basic training, but that's the military technique. We're going to break you down and we'll make you into something. So that was my introduction to Sergeant Green. As it turned out, when I left, I was platoon leader, and Sergeant Green, who was an African American, was also a great influence in my life, talking to me privately about leadership and what that was all about, and principles that he gave me. He even invited us 4 college graduates over to his house to meet with his family, and he was a person that I admired a great deal and have used his principles since then. So from there, I served at Dobbins for the balance of the 6 months. Then we were called back in during the Cuban crisis. Not Elian Gonzalez, but the one that had to do with bombs. One of my friends reminded me that when I was speaking to a group of young people about leadership, and afterwards he said, "You know, those people in the audience thought you were talking about Elian Gonzalez when you were talking about the Cuban crisis." To remember about these generational differences. From after the Air Force, then it was back into the insurance business, which I didn't particularly like, talking to young people about the importance of protecting their family, and they weren't all that keen on buying insurance to do that. So I got the opportunity to work professionally in politics and worked on some congressional campaigns, and then a friend of mine, John Grenier, who became national chairman of the Republican Party during the Goldwater years, asked me to come on board the staff, and I worked, my states were Florida and Indiana. Although we were very much, Goldwater was a terrific person to us. Also to me in particular because his non-discrimination. The issue in Arizona was Hispanics, and he had promoted Hispanics up to the top levels in his department stores. Also, I did some advance work during that time for Barry Jr., and he had flown into the Atlanta airport once, I think it was maybe a Sunday, and it was Father's Day. And when he flew in, he said, I need to talk to my father, so I arranged for a hotel room and got him on the phone with his father. And I could tell from their conversation that there was a tremendous bond between the two of them, and that they really loved each other. And that also impressed me about the goodness of Barry Goldwater. So that lasted through let's see, I guess after 64. Then I was out of a job, of course. We lost the election by 14 million votes, which we were expecting, but it was a cause. And so I needed a job. Went to see a friend that was a recruiter, and he said, well, I won't charge you anything, but I know this guy that is selling bonds, and I don't know what it's about. Go see him. So I went out, and he was selling municipal bonds to banks. And I was with that company for maybe a couple of years, calling bankers and selling them municipal bonds. We kidded that when I started with it, we were sitting on orange crates. We weren't really, but it went from there. And so I had to call bankers, talk to the presidents, the chairman of the board, and try to sell them on bonds to buy for their own portfolios. And my favorite was Bert Lance, who was head of the bank here in Georgia and then became budget director during Carter's time, because I could always call him up on Friday afternoons. And if I talked long enough, he'd buy 5 bonds, and I'd have enough money for the weekend. So I've always been grateful to him. And then from there, I organized with myself, organized or others, a succession of brokerage firms, ending in the last one being Herithor and Jones, where we had quite a large number of employees. I don't remember exactly, but 200, something like that. And between the salespeople and support staff. And I not only helped with running the firm, but also did underwriting of issues, which were then sold to dealers. And during that time spent many weeks in New York working with major brokerage firms up there, various deals. So much so that when I'd leave the Marriott when I'd leave the Essex House in Central Park South, they would think that I was going on vacation because they thought I lived there. But I could always get a cab in New York because for some strange reason, if I held up my hand, I got a cab. And then one day I was on 42nd Street in front of the Grand Hyatt. This cab almost runs up on the sidewalk and says, "Hey, Mickey, come on, get in the car." And those cab drivers thought I was Mickey Mantle. And so that was my secret to getting cabs in New York. And getting tables in New York, Alan Jones worked perfectly because the older waiters and maitre d's must remember Jack Jones, who was the one that sang the Donkey Serenade. And somehow, and he had a son named Alan Jones, and they must have been big tippers because I called that name, even though they knew it wasn't relations. It was just hit something in their minds, and they give me the best tables. Do a wonderful job. So I always enjoyed New York and got to know it very well. And throughout all that visits, people I found very kind and friendly. And so I saw, because we were closing deals, we'd have to bring up the county chairman and what have you, whoever was signing the bonds, and close the deal in New York. And so I'd take them to the theater. I think I saw the opening of Annie, and we always, through the printer, we'd get front row tickets, and I think I saw that 4 times. But I saw lots of theater during that time, which was a tremendous opportunity. And then I decided to leave Harrison Jones to develop retirement communities, and I developed one in Richmond, Virginia, buying 30 acres of land in a huge planned development called Brandon Mill, and set out to develop that. And as it was completing the early components of the construction, then I sold it in '88, went back to financial consulting. And that, over the years, has turned into the mission of helping business people be a success, which may be helping young companies to start, which I enjoy tremendously, is taking people that want to start their businesses through a process of understanding all the components of operating the business and producing a business plan and 5-year financial forecast. We also still do market studies, feasibility studies, financial forecasts for developers all over the country, because I have a soft spot for them, having done it. And the mission is to keep them out of trouble. And then during that period of time, there was, in '81 probably, I had a very close friend named Ron Fontaine. We had lunch almost every Saturday at the restaurant, I can't remember, in Buckhead now, which was the yuppie hangout place. I don't remember what it was. And one Sunday, before I was meeting him, I picked up the paper and read this tiny little article in the paper where it said 6 or 7 gay men have been identified with a very rare form of skin cancer that usually only elderly people get. And I remember us talking about it at the time. And even with that little touch there, we were concerned that maybe that was it for us. We were all going to die. Because we didn't know, as it undeveloped, whether it would develop, whether it was, and neither did anybody else, whether it was coming from the ferns or track lighting, or of course the CDC at the time thought it was from Papa's. That was their first take on it, and then more information developed. Along about somewhere there in the middle '80s, Ken South and Kim Kimsey were heading Aid Atlanta, which the Interior Decorating Society had set up. And I saw Ken South in a quick interview on TV. That first office was on Cypress Street, standing down there and talking about how people that had contracted AIDS were showing up at the door. They had no money, nothing. Family had thrown them out. They were lepers. And so I sent the word that if they needed some help, they should be in touch, which they were. I remember asked me to come to a meeting. I went to a meeting down there, and you'd have to know the context at the time. At that point, we didn't know if by going in an environment where people had AIDS that you might catch it from the air. So that was a test to just go into that building. And so I asked them what they wanted, and they said, we don't have any money for salaries, we don't have any money for anything other than the program that the Mayor's Conference had done, which was called P.S. I Love You, Play Safe, No Less a Man. So I said, okay, well, we'll get $45,000, which was a lot of money in those days. So I took either Kim Kinsey or Kim South every Monday for several months. They met me at the Ritz-Carlton at 6 o'clock, and I would call in a couple of individuals, and I would say to them, you need to give me $3,000. They're not going to be any fundraising events, so you don't have to go to a meeting. Give me $3,000 because we need to take care of this. You'll be one of the people helping. Interestingly enough, I heard comments like, well, it'll never get to our bedrooms and on the north side. That's a downtown problem. hand over the money. And they all did. One gave me cash through another person because he was worried that if he wrote a check, even though it was to Helping Hands of Atlanta, which was the organization that I formed, that somebody in the bank might see it and call his mother. So I rounded up 15 people, glorious people that stood up. $3,000 is a lot of money in those days. It might be like asking you for $10,000 today. So then they said, well, why don't we have dinner and congratulate ourselves? So I said, okay. And one of them said, we'll go to the Ansley Club. And another one said, oh no, my mother will be there. And so we went through all these restaurants and no, can't go there, can't go there. So I finally picked the Ritz-Carlton downtown on a Thursday night, which nobody would be at. And so we had maybe 25 or so, and we asked the president of the Atlanta Medical Society to come and talk. And his talk was about what a terrible pressure it was on young doctors, because young doctors got out of school thinking they were going to cure people and do all these wonderful things, and all of a sudden these patients show up and they can't do anything for them. And so the inspiring thing was that somebody there picked up the check for the whole evening, and the waiters contributed all their tips, and somebody bought the wine. So then they all said, well, we need to do this more often. So I said, fine, we'll do it once a quarter, and we'll do, it'll be $250, plus you got to buy your dinner, because I want all the money to go to the service. And they got great amusement out of that. $250, pay another $35 for dinner. So we did that for maybe a year. I have a letter somewhere where Ken Kimsey wrote and said that money that was coming in from Helping Hands helped to provide for them getting grant requests. I think the figure was maybe $400,000. So during that same time, we provided money to other organizations. We'd meet in my condo and ask somebody to come in if they had something they needed. And a young fellow named Mike Edwards with long hair and holes in his jeans and sandals came in. And most of them that showed up looking for money were in suits or something. And so Mike was such a terrifically inspiring person and had a very clear mission. He'd gone to San Francisco, he'd learned how to do meals. We'd been concerned about the meals that were being done before, because we heard these stories about frozen dinners were being dropped off on the doorstep of people who didn't even have microwaves. And so we wanted to do something about it, and we put out the word, and he showed up and said, I can do this, and I've got a place. So we need this much money for the first month, and so we gave it to him. And I remember I even wrote him an extra check and said, go and do it, and come back, let us know if you need more. And from there, this Project Open Hand has probably done 10 million, 15 million in meals. And then there was Sandra McDonald, who had Project Outreach, and there was the touching event of Tuesday night dinners at the Shrine, which at that point, people with AIDS, PWAs, could not go out to dinner anywhere. It was obvious with the sarcoma and what have you, and the restaurants wouldn't take them. They were lost friends and what have you. So one of the true men of God that I met, Father Adamski, set up the Tuesday night dinner at the Shrine, where those with AIDS would come and others would volunteer to serve them. And it was a very touching event where we all had to learn to hug, no matter what the consequences might have been at the time, which, since we didn't know, again, where it was coming from, but it's important that everybody get hugged during those evenings. And we provided the funds, whatever you needed. And and then provided money for most of the seed money for most all the organizations that got started at the time.
So this is all during the 80s.
Right. They got, by 1988, they were on their feet, so we sort of declared victory and folded helping hands, and they progressed into large organizations from there. And then a couple of years intervened, and I decided, well, I'm missing this terrific board that I had that I was working with. So, and everybody had certainly, in innumerable ways, contributed their time and money and energy, and things were getting on even keel. I mean, now it was getting to the point where movie stars were wearing their ribbons, and it was becoming more accepted. So I said, well, what we need to do is we ought to have dinner once a month and do some business. We'll just network and do business together. And so I put together a group of 15 centers of influence, wonderful people, top leaders in Atlanta. And we had the first meeting of the Atlanta Executive Network. And about 60 people appeared. It happened to be on the night of the Rodney King riots. And I remember Joe Porter, who was a vice president at Bank South at the time, had to climb over burning cars in order to get to the meeting. And the TV was telling people in Atlanta, stay home, stay home. But 60 of them showed up. It was remarkable because one of our great worries at the time was whether we could get 60 males to put on name tags. This was one of my requirements, that they put their name and business on their name tag and wear the name tag, and get them in a room in a hotel, which was Colony Square, because somebody might see them, they won't be worried, and come by and see us and think and figure out we're gay, which I don't know how, but it was interesting that the fellow I picked to register them at the door was a wonderful African-American young man, entrepreneur. And so I thought it was significant on that day, when there were riots downtown, that the first person to meet them was an African-American, which sort of set the tone that we certainly don't discriminate against anybody. So after that, we started having the meetings on the third Thursday of each month. And with us talking, we said, you know, if we ever got to 200, this would really be quite a remarkable thing. Well, we breezed by 200. And before my 5 years was up, we topped out at 1,106 members. The format being that there was a meeting every third Thursday. People sat at rounds of 8. There was a facilitator at the table, and they did a couple of minutes on their business and the type of prospects they needed and what have you. And then we brought in the best speakers we could. The first one being, because I went for, on a scale of 10, I went for 9s and 10s in the community for my organizing group, and Tom Latimer, who headed Hill and Knowlton, arranged for Jack Sensolo, who was head of a major advertising agency in California and had just appeared on the cover of Fortune when they did a story, Gay in Corporate America. We had him as the first speaker. Prior to that time, a couple of meetings prior to that, I did not mention the word gay on the platform, because that would have frightened them, so somebody could hear it over the speakers. But we brought Jack in for the purpose of setting the tone, and he talked about how from his first interview, after getting his graduate degree, he said, you know, I went through all his credentials, but I'm gay. If you got a problem with that, I'm not going to work for him. And so he was out from the beginning on through. I started hearing after that from people about, I'm not putting up with this anymore at my business. I want to be myself. So I asked people, go and talk to them, tell them they need a non-discrimination policy. I remember one fellow coming back from a college who was terrified and said, I talked to whatever the management committee at a college they call, and told them, and they said, okay. And sort of like the story of a gay person going and coming out, and the parents say, "Oh, so what else?" And that occurred with many companies. Then I had told everybody that I would always protect the database of their names and information, because I wanted to collect demographic information as well as just names, and that nobody would ever get their hands on it, which nobody ever has while I was there. And that we wouldn't have any media, but unless I asked them to vote on it. And so maybe a year down the road, when we were getting 400 people for meetings and whatever, they had become self-empowered by being in a room full of 400 people that were like-minded, and we voted, and they voted like 96% to allow the media in. And the Atlanta Business Chronicle did a front page story as we gave it to them as the appropriate one to do the first article. About 600-member gay network in Atlanta comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And in that article, I talked about, probably, I don't know, I'll have to get the article, I talked about that it was to develop that critical mass first, before, that's why we were presumably closed to the media. But from that point on, I just saw remarkable things occur in terms of self-empowerment. I remember people coming up to me during one Christmas season and saying, my love and I have decided that we have a home. And so going home for Christmas is not where our home is. And we're staying at home having Christmas. And our parents can come and visit if they want. So things that I incurred in terms of empowerment was very important. One of my ideas along the way was that directors should have luncheons every week so that you can network in a more informal environment and talk about business and do business. So we did that, and I've continued to do that every 2 weeks for at least 10 years now, and continue to do it now. And it was one of my rewards. I told them when I was finishing my term at that meeting that it had been wonderful, but now I'm getting to do what I wanted to do, which was to sit at a table with you so that I could network together with you, which I never had a time to do during those terms. During those times, before I introduced the speakers at those meetings, I would always do 4 minutes exactly, which was based on some issue that I felt was important. And one was that they should put prayer back in their lives. John Lewis had said in a book about prayer, every great movement is characterized by prayer, except, and he didn't say this, but the gay movement wasn't. And I was saying, you need to put prayer back in your lives. Well, I got an email from a guy afterwards that said, me and my 4 atheist friends that were there think that you're discriminating against us. So I said, well, come to lunch and we'll talk about it. They didn't respond. So, but what was more important was young people, because we always, from the beginning, a student could attend free and could be a member free, didn't have to pay anything. I had young people come up to me and say things like, when I was trying to leave the dormitory to go to church, I would get too much hassle. And it's very important to me that I see a leader saying it's okay. And so that was significant. Drugs, I talked about drugs. We had quite a discussion at our board meeting before I talked about drugs. They said, now Jones, you're going to meddling now rather than preaching. But I talked to the assembled group about the Chamber's catchword at the time was drugs don't work. drugs, can't be in business and do drugs. So I said from the platform, I talked to him about your centers of influence. And I want you to be the example to people that drugs don't work, because I've seen enough of the results of drugs and they don't work, period, none. And you're the leaders, and I expect you to do your job. And it was more than one time I talked to them about that. And I could see some people that I'd known privately that did some recreational drugs kind of cringing at that, but the message was clear. For some reason, I never touched drugs. Now, during the 70s, I was two or three friends, Ron Fontaine, Jerry Dilks, who used to own the Lion's Head, which was the first really exciting place on Peachtree that we had. It wasn't gay, but it was gay-oriented. And Jesse Peel, and there were some others. We bought or took over a restaurant called Peachtree and 25th. Now this was like going into enemy territory, because all gay people only go downtown way after dark so nobody will see them. And here we were, flat out on Peachtree. And it was called Shelley's, and it was a glorious place where the dining room was on one side. There were these great high-back red chairs where you could sit at a foretop, and if you'd almost be enclosed in your own cocoon. And then there was a dance floor, a small dance floor and bar with a DJ. What I told the staff there was, nobody goes to a bar if they got everything they need at home. So anybody that comes in here, you're going to make them welcome and introduce them around to everybody. Now this is something, this is different. And so if you came in, you got introduced to whoever was there, or at least a number of people. If you sat down at the bartender was going to make sure that you knew about these people. And it was sort of a clubhouse. Now to run a business, we knew that 80% of our money comes from a 20% affluent group. So I went around town giving out free cards to very attractive young people, and that kept that 20% that was spending all the money coming to the bar. So it was always crowded. We had a glorious time, and those were in the days where everybody, by the time a bar closed, had paired up. Those were in the days when sexual liberation was coming around. And so
You're talking about the early 70s?
This was probably 70. Sexual liberation was a little bit earlier than that, but this was certainly at the height of it in the late 70s, 76, 77, 78, somewhere in there. And so the environment at that time was everybody paired up, and the trick was you did it early, so you didn't reach the last person. And of course, nationally, what was going on was there was an intensity about sex, of it escalating into weirder and weirder things, certainly in the meatpacking district of New York and other places, which later in thinking about it, what people were searching for was that something that the void that was empty on the inside of them, and did not know that they needed to look inside themselves rather than escalating their sexual adventures. But of course, straight or gay, everybody, it was very open at the time, very free. And then AIDS came along, and that stopped it all. People began to discover that they could fulfill themselves by looking inside. The fellow I mentioned, Ron Fontaine, who was, I was in the investment banking business and flying and traveling around all the time, and he said, I'm going to have and I don't know what they call them, but it was part of the P.S. I Love You campaign, where you gathered a number of people at your house, and in a fun environment, you taught them things about what was going on. So he told me, I'm going to have this event, and said, you're to be there. So I flew back, but I remember even getting out of the car across the street from him, I was thinking, oh my goodness, suppose he's got people with AIDS there, and this is a real risk. So, well, did it, and there were maybe 50 or so people there. One of the things that, and I think Kim Kinsey led that for us, and one of the things that he did was had everybody count off 1, 2, 3, 4, and after that was finished, he said, okay, now everybody that's number 4 stand up, and he said, in Atlanta, 25% of the people are estimated to be HIV positive, and you don't know who they are, and you can't tell by looking at them who is. And then those people that each group of 4 then split off and went to a separate area to come up with all the fun ways that they could have safe sex. And there would be things like have sex with a virgin redneck from Cobb County, or make love to your VCR. But what it was doing was it was beginning to get the message through that there is other ways to fulfill yourself by loving and touching people and caring about them and developing relationships. And then there was play acting about how to react in a bar. If somebody said, let's go home, you'd say, no, I'll have lunch with you. And if they say, no, I don't want that, then you know what their intentions are. They're not interested in you. And this was all training. And then we used up every dildo in the Southeast, because all of these groups that were going on at the time, you had to have the dildo so you could teach people how to put condoms on. Because if you can imagine, this was a mystery. This is anachronistic, but this was a mystery to people about how to put condoms on. So that was part of that session, was how to do this mysterious thing.
Condom education.
Right, so the whole thing was an educational kind of thing.
I would like to go back, if you will, and tell us a little bit about coming out, or when you knew something was different about you, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I knew very young that things were different. I couldn't verbalize them or talk to myself about them, but I knew that things were different because you experimented with other boys, and which everybody does anyway. But I knew something was different. I had some experiences in high school, just the most glancing kind of experience with 2 or 3 people, and probably nothing in college, but by the time I got out, certainly sometime in the 60s, because there was a group of straight people who become very prominent now, so we won't talk about their names, but that I hung around with. And we had Friday night soirees. We would cook down for each other, and so we were very close companions, male and female, and they all got married. So I got married too, and I realized immediately this was a terrible mistake, and so I ended it within 6 months, and that was the dividing line where I said, okay, I'm gay. And shortly after that divorce, I ran into the first somewhat longer term companion, which lasted a couple of years, who was a popular young piano player in Atlanta. And then from there to the second longer term companion, which was maybe 8 or 9 years. And then from there to one other longer-term companion. All of whom are still around and are still close friends. It was good experiences. In business, I was in the investment banking business and in Harris Thorne Jones, and so I had flexibility. You can't exactly complain about the boss. And so I did share that with my partner, and actually took the partner that really owned the business, took him to Shelley's, which was a gay bar that we changed into a gay bar at the time, and a gay restaurant. And he had a lovely time and danced with his wife. There was just never any problem. I never encountered any problem in the investment banking business. But of course, how are you going to complain to the boss? I remember sometime later, I did interviews for TV, and there were newspaper articles and things like that. And on one of the national coming out days, a reporter from the New York Times called and said, wanted to talk to me about coming out, and somewhere during the conversation we were talking about it all, she said, well, you come out at work, and I said, well, it's only me and one associate. I have to come out to the mirror. And she said, well, it wouldn't have done you any good anyway, because I've read your file, and you've been on so much TV and newspapers, everybody knows by now anyway. So I said, yeah, guess you're right. It seemed to me, though, every time I was...
Let me stop both of this. Alan Jones, picking up with the interview.
And some of that went back to the files in the 60s after I graduated from Tech. I went to a Young Republican meeting with my brother-in-law and out in DeKalb County. And there were maybe 6 or 8 there. And I said to him afterwards, you talked about a lot of things, but you weren't doing anything. And so next meeting they elected me president. And somehow I came across the Practical Politics and Action course from the Chamber of Commerce that taught you how to organize a precinct. And so I took that on, and the next thing you knew, I was on talk radio talking about how to organize precincts. And then that led to me running for Young Republican, state Young Republican chairmanship, which I served 2 terms, which might have been from 62 to 64. And I think it was the first one, right after I was elected. The PR person of this incoming administration was Oscar Persons, who is a very prominent lawyer here in town now, wonderful person. And so we were meeting at a restaurant downtown, and I said, what we need is an issue. And so I said, Oscar, why don't you go down to the Journal-Constitution and ask the editors about what issue we should be interested in. This is naivety. We were young. So he went, he came back and said, they said milk. And I said, what? Milk? And he said, yes, they said, the Milk Commission sets prices in Georgia and is ripping off consumers. Okay. And they said that we should have a press conference and attack the Milk Commission for this price setting. So I said, okay. So we had a press conference at the Piedmont Hotel, which is a big hotel downtown that doesn't exist, on a Saturday. And so our Young Republicans were there, and one reporter from the Journal-Constitution. So I went through my thing about what the Milk Commission was doing, and the only question that the reporter asked was, why did you say Democrat Party rather than Democratic Party? And afterwards I said to Oscar, are you sure you got that right? What were you supposed to do? And he said, yes. Well, the next morning, Sunday, we woke up, here's the headlines. Young GOP attacks Georgia Milk Commission. Well, that set things off, and for the next 3 months I was on television or in the front page of the newspaper every day for 3 months, which culminated in us holding hearings around the state, starting in the state capitol, where the national networks also picked it up, with us attacking the Milk Commission and not having very much idea about what we were doing. But we obviously were giving them a very hard time because they threatened to kill me and all my family. Fortunately, in those days, that was before people were actually killing people, so I didn't carry through on those threats. But we had hearings at the state capitol here, and I think in Macon and maybe Savannah. And in the process, one of the top guys on the Milk Commission resigned. He had a convenience store where all the maids would get off in downtown Atlanta. They'd have to buy their food at that. And he had his prices jacked up pretty high, so we gave him a hard time about that. He finally resigned from the Milk Commission. But what culminated all of that was all the TV stations in Atlanta calling, wanting to cut their programs in prime time and for me to do a debate with this fellow. And Oscar had the unenviable task of trying to negotiate between those three TV stations. And of course, he didn't have the experience, neither did I. Nobody had the experience how to negotiate with TV stations. But at any rate, we finally picked one of them. I don't remember whether it was Channel 5 or Channel 2. And I did that debate at 8 o'clock. And it flooded the switchboard. All that publicity at the time was what she was referring to. Go back and read it, plus all the things that I talked about over the years when there were particular issues that came up, particularly during the AIDS time. One thing back to the Atlanta Executive Network, I was having lunch with the incoming president today and telling him we were talking about the development of it, and I said, well, it always, and I was talking to him about leadership, and I said, well, I can tell you what my perspective was at the time, that God wanted to do something for gay and lesbians, and he picked the lesser of the human beings to do it. And I was just amazed at what was occurring and just felt that I'm along for the ride. What are you doing now? With all these people showing up and everything. But during that time, it occurred to me that people do not want to see a president in bars, drinking, doing other things. So I stopped drinking and haven't drank since then, and stopped going to bars.
Since when?
That would have been in the, probably the late 90s, I guess, because my term, I finished up in 97. Because if I'm going to talk to him from the platform about, here's what I need you to do, I couldn't be seen doing any of those things myself. It was no big thing to give up. My life was enriched after that because God had his own plan about things, and I was dazzled by being along for the ride. But my point being to the incoming president was follow the Harry Truman philosophy. He said, when I'm in the Oval Office, I'm president, and you'll salute and say, yes, sir. When I go across the street to Blair House, I'm just Harry, and you don't owe me anything. And so I talked to other incoming presidents about that when you enter the door at a meeting, you just make the change. You're going on stage as the president, you're a leader, and you need to rise to those occasions. When you're away from there, you're just Harry and Jim and David and whatever. And remembering that pride goeth before the fall. That's one thing that I try to remind myself, having learned from a lot of other experiences in life, remind myself all during the AEM days. And because naturally when you're out front like that, people come up and say, oh, that was just the most wonderful thing, and the things you said were so great, you're so wonderful. And I would always be reminding myself, they're talking to the AEM president and not me. To help myself during those times, I started going to Friday afternoon movies with Michael Laycock, who was, I believe he had a long title, but he was something like co-chair of the Emory Medical School. His whole career he spent at Emory before he retired. A close friend. Barry Baker, his companion, who was an emergency medical room doctor, and Tom Griffin, who was a retired doctor, although young, because they all knew me. And we could go and just relax and be ourselves, and that was sort of a release from having to be careful, because I learned once going through either Phipps or Lennox, the next meeting somebody said, "You passed me and you didn't say hello." Wow. I'm only up to 6,000 in the database. So from that point on, I just say hello to everybody, wherever I am. And so that was, let's see, I just wanted to get back to that point, that the importance of bringing God back into your life. I know people like to discuss that a lot about, they see those, the evangelical people on TV, and of course all the discussion about the morality and played its role in the election. It's very frustrating to gays and lesbians to see these statements on TV that the talk shows want to get these people that are out on the fringes because it makes good sound bites. And gays, when they're on the programs with them, often get into the trap of throwing them questions about how could you possibly believe that gays should be killed. Well, that just gives them all kinds of fodder. I've always thought what you should do is look at the people in the audience and say, if you want to know the facts, read the Bible. Start at the beginning and read it. Now, I did that a few years ago. It took a year because there's so much to think about as you're going. But you will find that in Isaiah, which is what they always like to quote, it's an abomination, you'll be put to death. And I said, well, now you got to read the next one. If you curse your mother and father, that's an abomination, you got to be put to death. If you wear polyester and eat, etc. The thing being, you really need to understand this history, because I talked about this from the platform once. Most people only have about a 2-year education in the Bible. 84% of the population says they read the Bible, but actually they only have about a 2-year second grade education in the Bible. And if you read it from beginning to end, you find out what the true story of love is. And at that particular time, God was taking people that never, this was the beginning. We didn't have any civilization, and he's having to set up rules for how you're going to do everything you like, what to eat, what to wear, what to do. And God had the job of developing a population. And we can't be developing a population if you straight people are around having sex with other straight males, and it was more focused on that than just the total promiscuous of having sex with everybody, people's wives, having sex with cattle, and everything. God's trying to straighten all this out, so he lays down the law. You do these things and you're dead.
Oh, nice. Has religion always played an important role in your life?
From the time that I was probably in my 8 to 10-year-old range, I became a born-again Christian at that time, and then a youth preacher and what have you during my high school period of time. But even at an early age, I was at daily Bible school and vacation Bible school and those kind of things, and went to church regularly. That made an impression. That gave me a base. Now, there was a long stretch of time there where I was a great son, but that base was always back there somewhere. And I was kidding with one of Atlanta's prominent people that I've been friends with for 40 years. I said, now, most all of our friends have died. He's straight. So the straight friends, the gay friends, most all of them have died. Why do you suppose we're still here? There must have been something that we had to do. And that particularly the Helping Hands, the Atlanta Executive Network, those were things that's when I was coming back around. Wait a minute, now we're getting our act back together. There's something more important here. And then God putting me into that circumstance, that certainly brought me back around to understanding this partnership that was available.
Can you think of any other aspects of your identity, the person you think you are, that have played a significant role? So it sounds like belief has been a very big, important part of who you are. Can you think of any others that have played an important role?
There's been lots that have come in and out. There was a Catholic priest that was the type that he was never popular with the hierarchy. And they always sent him to the remote parishes, and he would, all of a sudden, church would be full. And so they'd send down somebody else. Now you've got a full church, and send him to some other remote place. But he was there was one of a series of what I would call the real men of God that I have encountered. And I remember he came to Atlanta, and he was actually the one we asked Ron Fontaine, and I asked him what we ought to name the company that was going to own Shelley's, and he said, why don't you call it Chez New, my house, which was what we named it. And then I remember we gathered for a Sunday morning around a swimming pool, and he gave everybody general absolution. Now that didn't relate particularly with me being a Baptist, but I knew them, that this was very important to the people there that were Catholics, and I knew that that was a big deal for him to do that. But he was a person where if you were in his presence, you knew that you were in the presence of a really good man. And he was straight. He was, Sergeant Green had a big one. I'd have to flip through my mind all of these events we've been talking about, but every stage there were people that I've been fortunate enough to run across that certainly gave me principles to live by. Go ahead and expand on the question.
Well, I was thinking more along Sergeant Green specifically, how race has played out.
Well, of course,
your observations, race relations,
and the family. This was certainly probably one of the big things. As I said, my father died when I was 1. My mother had to live on, I think the maximum that the pension ever was $86 a month. Of course, things were different economy then. The movie in Little 5 Points was maybe 10 cents or a quarter. Cokes were maybe 5 cents, that sort of thing. But still, that was a minimum amount of money. So all of the children went to work as soon as they were old enough to contribute. But this is not an unusual thing because the children in all the neighborhood did. But the significant thing was that the home was always filled with love. All the brothers and sisters were around. I always remembered happiness and neighbors and relatives dropping in, and there was always room to put another plate on the table and feed anybody that came by. And so, as I told people, I thought I was rich until I was 18 and went to Georgia Tech and found out there was people that had other things. The problem today is we didn't have, television was not that pervasive then. The problem we developed all over the world is people see these things and develop such expectations or envy enough or hate enough to kill us because they see us as consuming so much and having all these things. And what I found when I was developing the retirement communities in Richmond, Virginia, this development where I bought this property was the perfect place to live. Big lakes, golf courses, every activity you can imagine. But to afford that, mostly it was the two parents were working. Well, where do you suppose in Richmond had the highest instance of teenage pregnancy, alcoholism, drug use, and everything else? Right there in this area, because they missed their parents. And what children really want is they want the love of their parents and not things. And that's a message that I give to straight people is those working yourself to death and never seeing your children is not, just to give them things is not a good idea. They would love you no matter what the circumstances. I said I thought I was rich until I was 18.
You grew up in Atlanta, and curious to know what decisions, if there were decisions you made as to stay, you know, why you stayed in Atlanta. Why not move to New York? What about Atlanta?
Atlanta was, I never seriously considered leaving Atlanta. All that time that I spent in New York was glorious experiences. The time I traveled overseas in Europe, tremendous experiences. But I guess I had this need to stay where my history was and where my roots were. And so I never seriously considered that, although there were many opportunities that came along to leave and go somewhere else. Now, I did my million miles after I started keeping records, and I did a lot before. And they were certainly interesting places, and all the places I've been and enjoyed, but I was always happy to get back to Atlanta. And, you know, this is a very interesting point you bring up, because just in today's paper, there was another group has been formed to try to express to the world what Atlanta is. You know, we've always been terrible about that. But being able to say what Atlanta's all about. I know when the Olympics came along, a friend from Florida was going to come and stay with me, and I thought, okay, well, I'll come up with some things that he ought to see. So I went downtown, looked around. I said, well, there's not much here. So what is Atlanta? Well, it's the people. It's the in-home entertaining. Shopping is, of course, something significant, but I think we have never been very good at expressing outside what the essence of Atlanta is. And perhaps this Nearest Committee will come up with something that if they talk to enough people, maybe they can figure out, okay, here are the real elements, and this is what Atlanta is really about that we can tell the world about.
I want to go back to after the divorce, and you've come out to yourself, and you're seeing men. I'm interested in your observations or what you were aware of in terms of, for lack of better words, gay life in Atlanta. Reflections on how you met.
Well, one of the interesting things which usually amazes people is that at a period there, maybe in the 60s.
Early 60s?
Could have been. Cypress Street, which people later thought of as where hustlers would hang out and druggies. Cypress Street at 12 o'clock on Saturday night was a meeting place. All of a sudden, within maybe a half an hour space of time, all of these cars would converge, people would get out of the cars, and the street would fill up, and that's where you met people. And then, of course, that gay bars started opening. When I was at Georgia Tech, first time I ever heard about a gay bar was at Georgia Tech, although I didn't know what I was hearing. A couple of my peers there said, we're going to Miss P's to watch the queers. And I thought it was a restaurant, and I could not get this concept of what are these guys doing? I know I'm not going because I don't want, I mean, if I walked into that environment, all of a sudden the light would go on. But that was the first time I heard of something. And then there was a little place on Peachtree near 14th, I think. No, near North Avenue. There was a little place there that maybe 6 or 8 people could gather around or something. The first time that I was exposed and was really just fell over was I had noticed when I was driving, going out on Friday night, and was on Monroe, that this place name, and I think the first name was where the Rose Room, which was a big dance place for Atlanta, straight dance place used to be. I think it was Chuck's Rascal was the first thing. And I kept, as I'd drive around, I would see 2 guys or 3 or 4 guys together walking in, seemed fairly nicely dressed. And so finally, after a few weeks, I got up the nerve and walked in, and maybe there were 1,000 people in there, and I was just stunned. I could do nothing except just sit there and try to comprehend that there was a place where everybody gathered. And then, of course, that was the days of Mama D, who owned, later, successive to that, Mama D owned, and her 2 boys owned the Locker Room and Hollywood Heights. And that was a big dance place, and the Locker Room was where you went in and had sex. And that was a rough crowd. As you know, one of her sons was sent to jail for murdering a bar owner or something, but it was pretty well known in Atlanta at the time that you could easily get killed if you opened a bar and competed with anybody. And when Chuck's Rascal closed and somebody else opened it, we were actually, my friends and I had been up in Highlands. We were coming back to go to the opening, and heard on the radio had been burned down the night before the opening. So that was a scary time. And it was somewhat of, it was certainly something we had to think about when we opened Shelley's, because we could get shot or burned out. It was interesting at the time that, and I didn't learn that we never had a problem. And in fact, Mama D would call up and insist that I bring anybody over I wanted to, and they could get in free. And she was always very nice to me. I didn't learn until much later that the Atlanta police had put out the word that those are the rich queers and you better not touch them. And so, and they even assigned us a special officer that if we had any problem, he would come in the back door and take care of it, a special sergeant or lieutenant or something. So we were oblivious to this at the time. We just knew that everybody was being nice to us and we had no problem. But it was much later before I heard that that's what had occurred.
What was your perspective on kind of mixing, if you will? Did you see a lot of men and women in the same places? Did you see the interracial mixing of?
That was one of the things about Shelley's. I made women feel comfortable, and I remember very well now there weren't many that came there because there's always been complete discrimination between gay men and lesbians. And but I made any that came comfortable, and there was a doctor and her lover that drove up from Macon or Columbus every weekend to have a nice dinner there because that was the only opportunity that they could do that in that surrounding. But basically, Atlanta stayed segregated between black and white, female and male, and also probably young and old, of course, today, and probably all throughout all of that. So there's always been that kind of thing. I was talking to a group of young people somewhere, and I may also have said something like this at the theater, that if you want advice, you need to look further than 2 years this side and 2 years this side of you, and the idea is get mentors and call them seniors, wealth of information there. And a senior to some people is a 30-year-old. If you're 18 or 19, so call them those 30-year-old seniors, and
Right.
they know lots that you don't know. And you're really not going to die because you had your first breakup.
It is about perspective. I want to open it up for you and just open up the floor, and if you have any concluding remarks for the interview.
I guess if we focused on being gay, I knew from an early age in the back of my mind what was going on. It took a while, as it did people, to come out. And it's very fortunate today that people are not as threatened as they were in the past. But I guess the message is to be optimistic. During the AEM days, I brought Bruce Hayes in, who was an Olympic gold medal winner in swimming. I arranged for him to set up a press conference for him and CNN came and other stations with him looking into the camera and saying to high school students that are gay, I know you're having a hard time, but hang on. You're not even going to remember those people in a few years who were there. And you can do what you want to do, and just look at these medals. So that was an important message, I guess. One of the things that we often talked about among this wonderful group of people that had worked with me during the Helping Hands days and worked with me during the AEM days was leadership. And we have sought to try to develop leadership among the young people. And we have seen a number of them rise to those leadership positions. So that's been very important. But reinvention, I talk about that a lot. I guess Gorbachev was one of the masters of reinvention. He was reinventing himself every decade. And if I look back in the perspective, I have continually reinvented myself. And it was a big hit to take, to lose most of the people that you treasured. You go through life building up all of these close relationships and these friends, and then all of a sudden one day, poof, they're gone. And you got to start all over again. And as one writer said in the magazine, he said, this is tough. I'm 50 years old, and I'm not sure I want to start over again talking to 20-year-olds. How much do I have in common? But I find it a great fulfillment for me to talk to young people and encourage them about what they can do. That it's tough to get through all the crises you have, and certainly in the 20s and through the 30s and whatever. Things really get better later on. It's hard to see that. But to talk to them about focusing out. If someone a young person is having a hard time about some issue, whether it's money or relationships or whatever it is, I counsel them about go help somebody else. Focus all your attention on doing something, and you'll be surprised how that crisis will disappear. And too much, particularly naturally with the lunches, and clients, young people are very, as they should be, they're naturally focused on their careers and their success and what have you. And I try to counsel them, straight and gay, about if you really want success, you got to focus out and not focus in. It's not about me. It's about what you can do. And that's what networking is all about, is doing for other people without expecting an immediate return. And then you'll be surprised at what happens. optimistic about the future. Looking back, I've seen that I have reinvented myself a number of different times, and I suspect that will continue. And that's what I encourage people to do. There was an author we brought in that wrote a book about the various stages in gay life. And there's that, you get out of college and you go to the bars, and then as you pass through that, you go to the next stage where you maybe have a relationship and you're maybe moved out, you got your first house, and then all the way through these various stages. Some people don't make it. You still go back to the bar and see the ones that got stuck there when they were in their 20s. And there's nothing that is judgmental about, yeah, sure, you get out of college, you go sow a few wild oats, but you have to grow out of this and start reinventing yourself through all these decades.
That reinvention. Well, I want to thank you for coming in today and sharing your story, and I will stop the tapes.